Ladies and gentlemen, this has really been a wonderful day, and I thank you for sticking with us. And there will be wine and food after as a reward. I think you will find that the next presenter will provide us with rewards all on our own.
Whet our appetite.
So, Meredith Weiss received a MA and PhD from Yale University and has worked at the East-West Center, Washington, and DePaul University before joining it's now called University at Albany, where she's a full professor of political science. She's held visiting fellowships and professorships in Australia, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and the United States. She is founding director of the SUNY CUNY Southeast Asia Consortium. She's published widely on social mobilization and civil society, the politics of identity and development, electoral politics and parties, institutional reform, subnational governance in Southeast Asia, with particular focus on Malaysia and Singapore. Her latest books are The Roots of Resilience, Party Machines and Grassroots Politics in Southeast Asia, which is from Cornell, 2020. And she also co-authored Mobilizing for Elections, Patronage and Political Machines in Southeast Asia from Cambridge. I think that's the one I've been reading and having a good time with. She's also edited and co-edited over a dozen volumes, most recently the Routledge Handbook of Civil and Uncivil Society in Southeast Asia, Putting Women Up, Promoting Gender Equality in Myanmar Politics, and her articles appear in a wide variety of journals, including Asian Studies Review, Critical Asian Studies, Current Sociology, Democratization, Journal of Democracy, Journal of Human Rights, World Politics, and many others. Ladies and gentlemen, I've invited Dr. Meredith Weiss to be here, and she's graciously agreed because her work on clientelism relates, as you I'm sure will see. So without further ado, I want to invite Professor Weiss to come and present the keynote address for this Future Democracy Conference.
Thanks. It's such a huge honor to be here. I am grateful for the invitation and for all of you for staying, not just for the wine after, but for this, end of a incredibly fruitful day. And it's been amazing just to be listening to the talk so far and seeing sometimes disturbing parallels, but a lot of parallels. So what I'll focus on today is this idea of clientelism and patronage. In true academic style, I have woefully over-prepared, so I'm going to keep a timer here and cut myself off if I need to. So clientelism is an often used term, but often stretched. So what I'll start with really is what we mean when we speak of clientelism and how it matters for this political system or any political system. So I'll, on the one hand, clarify what those of us who do academic research on clientelism and patronage mean by it, and why it's prevalent, why it matters, and so forth. But however much I might seem to be homing in on jargon, on terminology, the goal really is, in line with the theme of the conference, to think through and hopefully spark even more discussion about, fueled by wine, what all this means for democracy, for representation, for equity, accountability, transparency, and more. So I'll draw on a fairly wide theoretical comparative literature and on my own research in Southeast Asia, as well as my own rather dismal experience of late in the US. So, and in particular, the key works I'm drawing on in terms of this conceptual framework are these two books that Dr. Strawn just mentioned, which these are part of a really large multi-year project with these three collaborators, my co-authors, and then a large research team across Southeast Asia in various combinations with edited volumes, journal articles, and so forth. The book here, the co-authored one, really focuses on patronage and clientelism associated with elections in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, plus several secondary cases, including Timor-Leste, which came up earlier. My own book here focuses on the character of clientelistic networks and patronage throughout the political cycle, focused primarily on Malaysia and Singapore. I am clearly not the one to speak to manifestations or impacts in the Bahamas in this region specifically, but I would love to learn more, especially as I've been hearing so many parallels with particularly Malaysia, just no doubt reflecting, at least in part, colonial legacies as well. And it's worth noting that these sorts of topics can be hard to research. These are topics that even the aspects that are legal are not necessarily socially accepted in ways that make people eager to talk about them openly. And yet, many of our interlocutors in this project were remarkably frank, especially where these practices are ubiquitous. So these two concepts, clientelism and patronage, its counterpart, are often treated as synonymous. We tend to use the terms really interchangeably. In fact, I find myself, despite years of work on this, using them interchangeably at times, but it is really helpful to distinguish them. Clientelism refers to networks of people. And when I give these terms, I'm pronouncing this like this is, God's own truth. No, this is a framework that my colleagues and I have stuck to, and we're trying to propagate it. But I do find it really helpful. So this is a personalistic relationship of power. These relationships are hierarchical, they're iterated, so they're repeated interactions over time, and they're reciprocal. So support or benefits from one is contingent upon a quid pro quo exchange. Sometimes there's a lag, but it's not a one-way flow. Part of the classic understanding is that these are dyadic, face-to-face relationships. In practice, though, brokers tend to mediate, so there's a pyramidal chain instead of just a one by one. So another term that's commonly used is patron-client ties. The patron is a person of higher status, social, political, economic. Clients are of lower status. A client has one patron, a patron may have many clients. But these ties are, again, reciprocal. Both patron and client need one another and benefit from the relationship. Patronage, in our usage, which, again, we are missionaries for this, refers to things, not people. These are material resources like money. In a political context, these benefits would normally come from public resources used to garner political support. Vote buying is a source of patronage, as in this cartoon here from the Philippines, but so is, for instance, conferring public contracts absent an open tender to one's favored contractors. Patronage may flow through clientelist networks, as from a patron to their clients, but not all patronage involves clientelism, nor does all clientelism involve patronage. It's much broader. So I'll say more later about other types of clientelist relations, but we speak of patronage resources and flows and clientelist networks, linkages, and ties. So governments dispense various sorts of goods and services among residents or sometimes just citizens. So pure public goods are what we might think of first. One person's consumption does not limit another person's. That's called non-rivalry. And once it's provided, no one can be excluded. That's non-excludability. So clean water, national security, public television, these are all supposedly pure public goods. And we can all find exceptions, but we'll leave it at that for now. A lot of goods meet only one of those two criteria. So things that are rivalrous but not excludable, sometimes called common property or common pool resources, are things like fish stocks or grazing land. If one person takes too much, others may not be excluded, but their use limits what's available for others. Excludable but not rivalrous goods are called club goods often. That would be like a movie theater or a community center. So having more people there doesn't limit access, but people can be excluded. Private goods are what's left. That's everything that's neither. So homes, clothing, books, a degree from a specific university or treatment at a private hospital, even if they're also public healthcare, public education as public goods. The boundaries may be hazy between categories, and they may vary with time and place. It sounds really straightforward. In practice, we find that these things are readily confused, and that's part of the problem. So programmatic distribution is what we technically normatively aim for. So that means the rules for distribution are known and available, and they are followed. Not that everyone benefits equally. So a program for young children, for instance, would not be germane for adults, but that anyone who meets the published criteria has equal access. Particularistic distribution, and here, no, I still want this one. It's not coming up. Okay, never mind. Particularistic distribution is when there's some sort of discretion that's involved, okay? So in this case, politics can enter. So a candidate or politician or other agent can exercise this discretion in determining what individuals or communities receive those goods and services. When we talk about pork barrel politics, for instance, that means discretion is exercised usually along partisan lines to benefit specific communities in exchange for expected support. When we talk more broadly about patronage or specifically vote buying, that usually means that benefits are channeled to groups or individuals or households more broadly in exchange for expected support. But there is no way in most places, now that we are largely in an era of secret ballots in most places that hold elections, to enforce that imputed contract in the exchange of patronage or payment for vote or other support. And I'll come back to that. Okay, so this is a scheme from a book by Stokes, Dunning, Nazarino, and Brusco in 2013. Note that they use clientelism to refer to the distribution of goods. That's the slippery definition to which I referred. There's an earlier version from a 2009 working paper that they don't seem to have published. That's kind of more clear for our purposes. What's especially useful in this version is the clarification of what is not patronage, what does not involve material resources or does not entail bias or discretion or contingency. So another way to conceptualize forms of patronage is then to home in on the scale of distribution as micro, meso, or macro. And this is where it gets a little jargony, but please bear with me. So this is what my colleagues and I do in that book that Ian's been reading. Okay, so micro-particularism. This is vote buying is the most common form, right? And so these are individual or household level types of patronage. Handouts to residents, especially voters. It might be money or it might be bags of rice or packages of noodles or prayer mats or services or all sorts of other things. This is often, but not always, in the context of election campaigns. In the countries on which my colleagues and I focus, this is ubiquitous in Indonesia. So these instant noodles of cleaning supplies you see here, things like that. And we found even politicians like this guy holding this up. This is a contract saying that so-and-so has agreed to vote for them. And it's not binding, but somebody has signed their name, meaning they may feel some greater moral suasion that, yeah, I took a handout, I'm gonna vote. Okay, and so in the Philippines, it is also ubiquitous to find vote buying, these micro-particularistic handouts. So this is the usual way in the Philippines. This is an actual one. This is for Mar Rojas, as it turns out. And so there's a whole art to how to fix the cash, using small notes so you can fan them out and so forth. We had people who demonstrated this to us and attach it to what's termed a sample ballot. Sometimes it's just one candidate. Sometimes it's but the term would be vote straight, vote for the full slate. Vote buying per se is less common, or micro-particularism broadly. It's less common in Malaysia, but then this poster here, the green one, says to take and use cash or cloth or sugar, but still vote for this non-corrupt PAS, the Pan-Malaysian Islamic Party regardless. It's common in a couple of states in Malaysia, but then also beyond elections in Malaysia, we find a ton of non-electoral micro-particularism. So over here, we find a gift bag from a Ramadan break fast with dates, water, and a headscarf. A lot of micro-particularism we find is kind of has at least in Southeast Asia, has a specific religious signaling. So that it seems, we want people, here is a set of, a prayer book with somebody's, politician's image on it. And in fact, Trump had Bibles too. So, not unique to Southeast Asia. All right, so these goods may signal identity or virtue in different ways. There is a lot of press and condemnation about this sort of micro-particularism, but there is in fact very little social stigma. Much to our surprise, many candidates and brokers and voters talk about this really openly, which led to some great conversations. So what do these handouts actually represent? How should we think about them? Should we be worried? So the standard view is that this is contingent targeting with an expectation of reciprocity. In plain English, that means you're buying someone's vote. That's what it's supposed to mean. So vote buying is targeting undecided voters. That's the usual definition. The literature tends to assume that swing voters, those who are not fully partisan, will be the most targeted. It actually varies in practice. Another idea would be turnout buying, which is when you target core supporters of another party to encourage them, that's abstention buying. Core supporters of another party, please don't vote. And we found candidates in the Philippines who talk about offering people a resort day, not to vote and things like that. We think most of that was actually imagining as opposed to real. Turnout buying is targeting your core voters to encourage them to show up to vote. But our research across these countries finds that even those distributing these handouts rarely expect voters to feel obligated to support them in return. And they really can't monitor and they can't really sanction voters who don't comply because there'll be another election. They need those votes next time. So what is it then? So scholars and commentators tend to treat these individual level gifts as contingency-based patronage. They pretend that there is this reciprocity, that you'll get the money and you will vote that way. We find it's actually generally not contingent, and instead, when candidates distribute patronage to individual voters and groups, they're frequently engaging in perhaps less menacing things. I mean, I'll get to why it's still not a great idea, but of what we term brand building, credibility buying, and turf protection. And these are all common, rational, and viable strategies. So first, brand building. This non-targeted distribution is meant to increase name recognition, to signal viability or generosity. It's often done as part of like campaign rallies. So it's not targeted or discriminatory. Everyone at the rally gets a free meal, everyone along the road gets a t-shirt, everyone in the neighborhood gets a bottle of water with a candidate's name and face. There is no real expectation on the part of those giving the handout that this will turn into votes, nor do recipients tend to feel any particular moral or cultural obligation to reciprocate. Though if it's something specifically religious, they may feel a little twinge. The goal is just to build a brand by distributing these handouts as widely as possible. So it looks more like a special form of political advertising than a targeted handout. Next, we say there is credibility buying, which is targeting presumed supporters to signal your viability as a candidate, signal that you're serious. This we can see as a type of entry ticket or the price of admission. So as a vote broker for one candidate put it, if you don't have money, you can't stand. Where other candidates are distributing largesse, not doing so can be fatal. Brokers and voters will judge candidates who fail to distribute funds as not serious contenders. Those candidates will find it difficult to recruit reliable brokers. The brokers, those are the ones who will actually go out and canvass among voters, will be more likely to shirk. Voters will likely dismiss the candidate altogether. So in effect, candidates find themselves trapped in a prisoner's dilemma. Choosing to be the only candidate not to distribute money ensures what's termed the sucker's payoff. So driven by voter expectations, we end up seeing more vote buying. So in the words of a voter in the Philippines, the election is harvest time for us, so we take advantage of the blessings as much as we can. Okay, next we have turf protection. So the presumption, again, in much of the literature on this stuff is that clientelistic relationships are relatively stable and binding over time. But we found that candidates fear that even so-called loyalists are actually quite fickle and prone to defection. So candidate after candidate and campaign worker after campaign worker, especially where parties are not super strong, express the same sentiment in our interviews. If loyalists are not paid during the election, they will cease to be loyalists. Loyalists will defect for the right price. And this is one of my favorite quotes that we came up with from this whole project. So targeting presumed supporters to hedge against defection or defending presumed supporters from poaching by rivals is an especially important thing to do and gives money to voters just basically to bind them to the party, that the money is thicker than water, than blood, basically. Okay. So next, moving on from microparticularism, mesoparticularism. This is, and I realize that the term is horrible. We didn't come up with a better one. So this is pork, club goods, or local public goods. This involves distribution of patronage to groups and communities. This can be geographic targeting, particular village or something like that, or it can be a group that's targeted. It's very common. It may be wholly legal and open. So, and indeed, patrons or politicians need to claim credit for what they've funded. So it tends to be quite overt. There are real benefits or appeal to this as a strategy. So it's less costly than dispensing cash or other patronage individually to voters. It carries much less social or legal stigma. It allows politicians to provide benefits to voters throughout the electoral cycle. And it promotes efficient monitoring by focusing on groups of voters rather than individuals if there is any monitoring. But we found these strategies, like in the Philippines, a barangay, which is a neighborhood within a city, that they would offer, the candidate would offer like a motorbike to the barangay captain, the one who is in charge of that neighborhood, if they vote straight, if they get a clean sweep there, so that they're sort of giving some moral suasion. Or even in Malaysia, where again vote buying is not common, a strategy of giving these vouchers redeemable after the election if not just you but all your neighbors, enough of them, vote for that candidate, that there's a win. So here we see a community center, this pork barrel building, aptly named in the Philippines, a road widening project, also in the Philippines, a promise, this one in Malay is a promise to build low-cost housing if the incumbent wins. And a reminder, also from Malaysia, hard to read, of one party's emphasis on securing funds for Chinese medium schools to serve the Malaysian Chinese community. These are all examples of mesoparticularism. So what role does this strategy play? Again, not usually contingent, however much candidates would like it to be. As a part of electoral politics, as with handouts to individuals, candidates allocate collective goods as a form of brand building, credibility buying, or turf protection. It is only plausibly contingent where there are representatives who can speak authoritatively for a community or a social network. Candidates then might distribute collective patronage and bank on the capacity of that group representative to be an effective broker, to deliver that promised block of votes from their network in exchange for the gifts. And this is a mapping from a candidate in Indonesia of how many votes he expected to be able to get from each gift, like a small irrigation area or television for a community center. For each of those gifts, how many votes he hoped each would translate into. Okay. And yet Indonesian candidates universally speak using, for some reason, the English term of the margin error, the margin of error in those estimates. Okay. That confidence really anywhere is frequently misplaced. It's not just Indonesia. It's a pattern that's less common, this block vote, than candidates tend to hope. There are ever fewer reliable vote banks, even where they used to be more common. And there needs to be a level of group cohesion and clear social hierarchy. For instance, in a religious community in which the churchgoers will follow a leader for this to work. So this type of practice has been eroded as a result largely of factors of development and modernization. I'll come back to this. But the networks that matter most for an increasing share of people are less those of affect or identity than those of benefit or trade unions and the like. So there's one viable and potent example in the countries we focused on of where this does work, and that is some religious communities. So this is the Iglesia Ni Cristo in the Philippines, or a church from it. This is a community that does deliver a block vote. And so if you're targeting Iglesia Ni Cristo and the leaders agree with the appeal, then that may actually yield results. All right, so each of these forms really does shade into the next. And then this next one I'll talk about, macro-particularism, can really blur the line between programmatic policies and patronage targeted at groups or individuals. This is because parties and candidates aggressively and creatively work to hijack or co-opt programmatic policies in a bid to turn them into or portray them as more targetable and contingent benefits. We call this hijacking of ostensibly programmatic policies in an effort to turn them into patronage, macro-particularism. Again, it's a horrible word. We couldn't, again, come up with better ones. But the goal of this is to spin the benefits of a given programmatic policy to the advantage of a particular party or politician. This is even when allocation decisions are actually centralized and neutral. Politicians can still work very hard to make them seem contingent on their personal or partisan intervention and discretion. So we can think of a continuum from fully particularistic, one person is deciding who gets what, to fully programmatic. And we're approaching the latter end with macro-particularism, where actual discretion tapers off. So as a result, from the voter's perspective, a programmatic policy appears particularistic or partisan. There is imputed contingency. So as a candidate, you work to convince voters that the provision of a benefit is contingent on your action, and your action is contingent on their vote. We come up with 3 forms of hijacking because we really like lists. The first is credit claiming. So this is when politicians and parties alter the character or appearance of a programmatic initiative by attempting to claim credit for providing a particular benefit to a particular beneficiary. It's not just that they claim to have been instrumental in an initiative's passage, which is the basic stuff of politicking. So for instance, this happened just as we were writing this book. These COVID support checks from Donald Trump. His name is on them. He doesn't have any authority to issue checks from the US Treasury. That is just nonsense. But it does make it look like he gave you money, right? And same with this gold card. Don't need to say more about that. But basically, we also see this in Southeast Asia. We see this in a lot of places. So in Malaysia, for instance, politicians tended to, until good governance body within the Prime Minister's office required that these be direct deposited, a massive national unconditional cash transfer scheme, politicians required that individual voters come to their office to pick up their check. No need for that. But they complained mightily when it was made direct deposit because it was harder to get a list of who would come and make it look like you're giving it to them. Okay, so this is part of the greater appeal, as came up earlier, of like building a new building rather than maintaining them. It's a visibility. So you can say, I did this, I built this building. All right, the next is facilitation. This involves connecting individuals or groups of voters with resources that they are qualified for, but which they may have some trouble accessing. So there is some value added here. It's a form of constituency service, as when a politician or their team helps citizens apply for welfare benefits. Singaporean politicians excel at this, and it's also a key strategy in Malaysia. So here, this is a scheme for entrepreneurial small and medium enterprises that they get a check from the government. Or you can go to this Barisan Nasional, the ruling coalition at the time, party office and collect it from your member of parliament, who will hand you the check, which is not from him, but from the government as a whole, the state. Okay, so there was a discussion this morning of an example of whether or why it is that the old lady up the street needs a politician to help her collect a pension check. That's facilitation. She doesn't. She could get it directly. It may, though, make it easier, especially when you have, in Malaysia, you have a lot of different languages. So if you can't access the state well, this is actual value added. The third is morsalization. So this involves the carving up of public projects or programs so they're produced and distributed according to political rather than economic or programmatic criteria. This turns a programmatic good into micro or meso-particularism. There is actual discretion involved, though still often less than they pretend. So a key area that we see this is scholarships. So transforming education into scholarships means that somebody decides who gets those scholarships. That can be done wholly neutrally, or it can be done with a degree of discretion. So we found, especially in the Philippines, but also in Malaysia, but the Philippines, it was really striking, how often politicians speak of doing this and the loyalty that you develop by giving somebody a scholarship. They are yours for life because you're changing their life. And in Malaysia, you have this language of a cable or connection to get an in to to be admitted to a school, to get a scholarship, something like that. That's the same sort of thing. It can be string pulling. There's a level of discretion involved to get access to a state program now. And it may be very hard for the average citizen to know for sure how much discretion was involved. All right, so all of that brings us back to the clientelism part of this puzzle. So the human networks involved. We can think of these networks, again, those are the list, in two primary ways: relational and transactional, or which is also called sometimes single shot or one time, and especially within that relational category involving networks of affect and benefit. So transactional clientelism versus relational. Okay, transactional clientelism is generally short-term and functional. This on the far side there is, sorry, I don't know right and left. It's the farther off one. It's generally, this is the classic brokerage structure for Indonesia, what's called a team success, a success team that helps a candidate win. This is an ad hoc, short-term mobilization network to distribute handouts and get out the vote. This structure collapses generally after the election. Then next time the candidate hires back another team of brokers if he runs again. On the other hand, we have relational clientelism. So this is an image from Singapore, a team from the People's Action Party, the ruling party since before independence. Relational clientelism is long-term and iterative. This is more the classic patron-client system of ongoing face-to-face connections, not defined by material patronage, though with the promise of protection from adversity. So, for instance, these MPs in Singapore who go door to door, making sure that voters see their face, they ask how they're doing, if they have any issues they'd like addressed, they help them, resolve spats with their neighbors, things like that. They might hand out pens or, something like that, but it's just about building a relationship. It's not about distributing handouts. We tend to see this pattern more than purely transactional clientelism, where parties and partisanship are strong, because this relational clientelism is what really helps to cultivate and maintain partisan loyalties. It helps to build a political party or a party machine. So comparative research suggests this persists even in advanced industrial democracies where it may be too expensive to buy votes. Whereas transactional clientelism or patronage, or these transactional networks, clientelism, tends to have a curvilinear relationship with economic development. So you would think that states that have more to spend could spend more on vote buying, but there's a less marginal value for that payment. All right. So we can also think in terms of the premise for a community or network. So networks of affect that are organized around religious or cultural or other social groups, or networks of benefit that are tied to income generating or employment or other material needs. So things like farmers cooperatives or taxi drivers associations, things like that. So both types of network have existed for time immemorial. But economic development, internal and external migration, and other long-term changes have led to a transition in many places from really strong networks of affect in political terms to networks of benefit as mattering more for many people. Networks of benefit in particular may increasingly rely on government officials, particularly at the local level, to channel access and benefits. So for instance, mayors and barangay captains in the Philippines, especially as the state takes on more roles. Those officials then, conveniently, may also serve to mobilize voters, but the network, that relationship, may extend well beyond just elections. All right, putting all that together, again, cognizant of time. Where and why do we find this? We find it everywhere, some forms of this. It is not this, we were trying to, is there some cultural thing? No, it's everywhere. But the relative ubiquity, the forms, and the effects vary a lot. So a number of factors contribute to explaining why we see especially heavy reliance on clientelist networks or certain types of clientelism. A key one is when and how elections and parties developed. And again, this research that we're doing is in a post-colonial global South context. And so, we do see elections and parties developing in different ways and at different times. That said, we do also have the US, so Tammany Hall, classic political machine. So the formation of political machines, especially the Democratic machine in New York City and Albany, was among the first, and then Chicago and others followed. This was prior to the expansion of the welfare state in the US. So parties took charge of not just socializing immigrants into the US and getting them out to vote, but also providing forms of insurance and other support. And that all helped to develop a relational network. Okay, so the machine politics, the machine parties that developed, this is a quote from the late Jim Scott, that ties based on charisma, coercion, or ideology are definitely subsidiary to the concrete particularistic networks that represented the staple means of political coordination. So in other words, this is a type of party and politics that's based upon providing services to your members, not charisma, not ideology, all right? And so where we have that develop, those patterns may persist. Electoral rules matter too. So how much do politicians rely on what's termed a personal vote? Vote for me, not for my party. As when parties are weak or when candidates are competing against members of their own party in multi-member districts with open list voting. So that's a ballot in Indonesia. It's multi-member. If there are 9 seats in that district, a party can list 10 candidates. I think that election there were 12 parties. So you have over 100 candidates and you're supposed to pick one. Your biggest rivals are the people in your own party because they're drawing on the same kind of ideological frame for what it matters. So how do you differentiate yourself? Particularist, interventions, all right? And so if we have these sorts of voting rules, then we may find that these patterns persist more and in particular ways. Second, a strong state bureaucracy may preclude these networks or serve to undermine them later. So if it's the state rather than the party that provides a range of welfare benefits, when citizens can readily access state services directly, they don't need intermediaries to help them, or when they believe that policies really are programmatic and they don't need to pull strings, we may find less reliance on these sorts of clientelist networks. The state then, sort of a side but important note, needs to have a monopoly on the means of coercion. So for instance, business owners can trust the police to keep their premises secure without paying off a mafia of some sort. But even with a high-capacity, accessible bureaucracy, citizens may find it easier or more comfortable or more socially the norm to talk to somebody they know and get them to intercede. Even if you can go to the state, you might pull a string when the string is right there, right? And so that still makes these patterns hard to get rid of. So that's where underlying factors really come into play. And the most important ones that we found were the local political economy and social structure. So how people organize themselves. When economic development occurs in a manner that produces local monopolies. So in the region we're looking at, around mining, plantations, or some other resource-focused industry are the main ways. I would have to imagine tourism might feature in a similar way. The far off picture there is an oil palm plantation in Sulawesi in Indonesia. That tends to empower politically the economic elites who control the industry without empowering workers or other local residents. So a frequent result is forms of local bossism, that an elite political capture, which tends to reinforce clientelism and may include also a greater tendency toward coercion. So local bosses may accept club goods strategies, but not really deliver the goods. They might not distribute them. So where the economy is more diverse, especially more urban or industrialized areas, ordinary people tend to be less reliant on one employer or patron. And programmatic appeals are more necessary to supplement or even begin to supplant patronage, especially in cities, right? So large, diverse cities tend to give rise to more programmatic politics. It's not that the people are necessarily different in their mindset. It's just that this is how they get what they need to survive. But the relative autonomy and egalitarianism of local social networks beyond just employment and economics also matters. The critical issue here is the relative density of civil society and the extent to which local community members can choose among networks or they're tied to a single option. Where local leaders are sufficiently powerful to direct the political behavior of their subordinates without having to offer something in exchange, they may be just incorporated into local political networks in ways that don't require sharing benefits and that really leave local voters without active agency. But where that relationship is more obligatory than voluntary, clients have especially little leverage to exercise agency, to ensure that they at least get a share of club goods that are provided. So if instead one can change jobs, one can move from one network of benefit to another, or one has different communities, these networks of affect on whom to draw, that may allow some level of agency and mobility. So processes such as internal migration, urbanization, tend to disrupt those ties. So different social cleavages may emerge as more important. So maybe socioeconomic class or occupation instead of ethnicity, and might essentially clear a path for new political patterns to take root. So it's important to note that conventional wisdom does often fault particular cultural traits for the persistence of patronage politics. Or we found really interesting statements by different candidates about whether women or men were more likely to sell their vote or to accede to that sort of imputed agreement. But we found very little support for any of that. I'll come back to that in a bit. But overall, regions marked by relative economic underdevelopment, natural resource endowments, state weakness, and strong or hierarchical social networks may give rise to patterns that are more intensely clientelistic and that also may incorporate a greater degree of coercion. By contrast, regions with relatively developed and diversified local economies, robust state capacity, and both dense and egalitarian local civil societies offer more fertile ground for alternatives to patronage politics. So coming back to this sort of, is this cultural? Is there something in a particular society? No, basically. Patronage works through and adapts to social divisions and categories, making use of whatever clientelist or other networks are available. So we see variety in the forms of patronage that reflects that diversity. So we find, prayer mats and headscarves versus rosaries and Bibles given out by the same politician to different communities. Or in this case, this is a Kadazan leader in Sabah in Malaysia, who was among those distributing prizes and gifts at a political party event that happened to coincide with a festival in his state. But the underlying patterns of patronage, its structure and functions remain the same. And that said, engaging clientelist networks is more likely to have a bonding than a bridging effect. So bonding social capital is a sort of mutual trust and understanding that develops between members of a social group that binds them more closely together. That can be through participation in organizations or religious communities and so forth. You see the same people every week. You come to trust them. You know that they would have your back. Bridging social capital is what develops between members of different social groups, often through regular economic interactions or participation in broader organizations, maybe trade unions. Both of these are important. It's not that one is good and one is bad. They're both important. They're both really helpful. And clientelist networks may form with either. But at least in Southeast Asia, we find more evidence of bonding appeals than in these sorts of policies. So it's trading on group identity, including by mobilizing politically through ethnic or religious organizations and networks, which then reinforces those networks. So that said, patronage generally subsumes and even domesticates the politics of identity. What I mean by that is particularly where electoral systems encourage broadly inclusive strategies. You can't win with just one group's vote. Patronage distribution regularly crosses identity group boundaries and thus tends to bridge divides, even if it also unites members of those communities rather than promoting, deeper bonding. So if politicians need votes from their own community and others, they may work through Christian church networks, but also visit local mosques and Hindu temples or court the leaders of both Chinese and Malay community groups in hopes that those groups will influence their followers. Gender falls into, we found, the same pattern. So matronage looks pretty much the same as patronage. There might be somewhat different groups that are mobilized. We had one candidate, an older woman in Indonesia, had what she called her team Nenek Nenek, this grandmother's team that went out and rallied voters. Or they may use gender differentiated items that they're distributing. But the process, the patterns are really the same. And that itself really was intriguing and not supporting a cultural argument to any significant extent. Only class is different. And that's because patterns of patronage distribution, like through clientelist networks, tend toward hierarchy. So patronage transcends class and tends to atomize voters to make a class identity that would otherwise bring voters together across strata, socioeconomic strata, much less salient. So we do see some class-based appeals. So there's a Malaysian Socialist Party, for instance, that competes in these same elections, but their appeal is ideological rather than per what the party provides. So it's not a patronage appeal. And that gets me to this larger point. Not all appeals, even in a place where patronage and clientelism are endemic, it's never the only thing. So we also see appeals based on programmatic policies like improving infrastructure or economic growth or education broadly or environmentalism. We see normative appeals that may focus on religion or socialism or another ideology. We see identity-based appeals without a patronage angle. So focusing, for instance, on self-determination. This is in Aceh in Indonesia, which had a secessionist movement and still maintains a strong Aceh identity, rather than for discretionary distribution. Or we see populism. So this isn't all good stuff. So appeals based on a leader's charisma, like Duterte in the Philippines. All right, so last bits of this. What are the pros and cons? So there are normative and policy implications attached to these patterns. Is the endurance of clientelism and patronage politics a bad thing? Not entirely, though a lot of it is. So relational clientelism in particular homes in on accountability. Citizens see and engage with politicians, and they can and often do take them to task if they don't follow through on their promises or if they're just not visible on the ground. For instance, former Deputy Prime Minister, still a member of Parliament, Wan Azizah Wan Ismail here in Malaysia, going to a night market. So this also redistributes resources to citizens, especially the poor. We should compare it not just with programmatic systems, but also with more predatory ones. At least citizens can extract something from the state or from more privileged patrons. So we found little evidence of what's termed perverse accountability. It's a term from Susan Stokes in these cases, which is when candidates or politicians hold voters accountable for voting the right way. And we think that's just because it's really hard to monitor how people vote or whether they do their part, right? Especially in elections. Strengthening these networks may be especially useful where the state is unlikely or unable to step in to provide support. We saw so many examples of this during the pandemic, of communities that the state couldn't or wouldn't support, but where there is somebody there, though, some network that will still help to trickle some aid down. So the community can provide a safety net with funding from a patron who's at the top of a clientelist pyramid, bound by what we term a moral economy of obligation, mutual obligation, and expectation through this hierarchical network. And in electoral terms, it's worth bearing in mind that where vote buying is ubiquitous, it rarely changes outcomes. It's just too common for it to matter, and the payoff is pretty limited. In the Philippines, for instance, we talked with families who split their vote. So, they look who's given them money, and it's helpful because they sample ballots. One person votes for one person votes for another. It cancels out. All right, the cons. So on balance, this is normatively not ideal for a democratic system. So more programmatic politics has real advantages. Patronage politics tends to be inefficient and to perpetuate poor governance. Distributional decisions may be made per political criteria rather than directing funds to where they'll do the most good. And this system tends to oversupply goods and services that can be targeted to narrow constituencies while undersupplying non-targeted public goods. Building a lot of roads instead of thinking about environmental conservation, for instance. In the process, especially given the appearance or reality of corruption, when politicians exercise discretion over who gets what, this sort of approach may foster distrust and cynicism among voters. Next, it may be highly exclusive. It usually is highly exclusive. So it favors those with connections or fall within the right camp rather than assessing all in terms of the same neutral criteria. It may give politicians an incentive to keep the state weak or hard to access, to keep themselves useful. So politicization of the bureaucracy may impede its functioning and probity, whereas these are things that could be fixed. It tends to increase incumbency advantage. It favors those who have state resources to distribute or who can at least claim credit for stuff the state did. In the process, it keeps legislators, in many cases, probably most, predominantly male and from other comparatively privileged groups. The high cost of sustaining a clientelist network and campaigning for election likewise favor the wealthy all the more. And this is working against an even playing field for access to elected office or other positions of authority, or they may just favor the corrupt. And those costs have to be recouped. So this raises the specter of capture and corruption of the state. If candidates spend that much on vote buying, how do they hope to get that money back? Even when it comes, though, to relational clientelism, which doesn't necessarily involve money, absent patronage, the linkages are asymmetric. The masses of clients are subordinate, if to different degrees, to the patron. That may give a disincentive to evaluate candidates programmatically in favor of someone you know, or came to a family wedding, or gave you a funeral wreath when you lost a member of the family, or you've seen them walking the ground locally. They're familiar, they're known. You know you could approach them, rather than somebody per their legislative record. And that's not necessarily the best way to spend your time as an elected MP, walking the ground. So it can lead to legislative immobilism. A lot of people just are absentees in the parliament if they're too busy being seen, right? But it also discourages legislators, again, from focusing on big picture, common good items instead of favoring whatever pork they can secure or what they can best morselize for distribution. So especially where vote buying is endemic, it also tends to weaken political parties, which then may harm pursuing a particular program. So overall, this sort of politics may serve to undermine or at least shift accountability and stall meaningful democratic consolidation in states that are transitioning from liberal regimes in particular. Voters see good reason to think small and expect very little, to understand their immediate needs as mandating that they vote for the politician they know, rather than evaluating them in terms of bigger policies, ideology, or their legislative record. So finally, what do we do? And I'm going to be very brief because I'd rather this be more of a conversation. These patterns may decline over time. So especially as people move around, break up networks and so forth, but it's really hard to break these habits. So for instance, this is a member of our local research team in Malaysia. We went to interview a politician. He lived in that politician's district. Must have just been force of habit. There was an election coming. Politician slipped him money. Like as we're leaving, colleague was horrified. We put it toward research expenses, but it's how habitual it is. We're just, does he not realize? Yeah. Anyway, there are no quick fixes. So reforms are really difficult in practice. They can be counterproductive as implemented. So the three possibilities are really all we came up with, which is why I'd love this to be a discussion. So electoral reform, including efforts to strengthen parties, to reduce reliance on a personal vote, and designing voting rules and campaign finance regulations and other policies to give an incentive to rely on programmatic appeals. So you're judged by your program. Second, reducing vulnerability. If only these were like small, easy fixes. So for instance, 30 baht, which is less than $1 healthcare scheme in Thailand, or Brazil's Bolsa Familia, livable minimum wage policies, all of these show citizens that the state is able and willing to provide, and they don't need to go to a politician. So if the state can provide these things, make them accessible. This is why we see such an emphasis, at least in Southeast Asia, on these like one-stop centers, e-governance initiatives. Some of them are just performative, but others are actually really designed and work well to make the government accessible to citizens so they don't feel the need to go through an intermediary. Okay. The rise of the gig economy works against some of those things because it just increases precarity, and there's a limit to what states can provide. Third, bureaucratic reform or reducing discretion, removing politicians as intermediaries. That can help. They may still claim credit, but at least they won't actually be distorting distribution. There's some evidence that virtuous circles also tend to widen. So where multinationals, for instance, in Vietnam, are tied to anti-bribery laws from overseas and subject to more rigid accounting standards and things like that, that may encourage other firms to follow suit. But again, these are somewhat more impressionistic, and it's hard to know for sure. The one thing we did find is that anti-vote buying campaigns generally are not very effective at addressing electoral patronage. There's just too little social stigma, and they can backfire by a smacking of elitism and a patronizing attitude to poorer voters. So with that, with my apologies for taking so long, I'm going to stop, and I would love to hear more from all of you.
Great. I have a preliminary question before I get to the actual question.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of, he's very controversial, I know. Have you ever heard of Carl Schmitt?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay, so you know where I'm going with this. At least with the examples we use of leaders of countries like Duterte, including, can I say his name?
Let's just call him DT.
Yeah, DT, right? There's this whole theory about the exception of the sovereign, that the leader of the organization or the country or the party can basically suspend the Constitution, do anything they need to do in the furtherance of the quote-unquote interests of the state, which we've had here during a pandemic where the Prime Minister said that sometimes he has to violate the Constitution in order to save lives. My question is like, well, obviously it seems like you do understand, is like, how interrelated is that with your research?
It's something I've never really thought about, but you're right, this is such a clear link that I haven't drawn. So in some ways, we can imagine that these patterns might habituate voters or citizens, residents broadly, toward thinking in terms of accepting this hierarchy, because that sort of claim fundamentally suggests that those who are at the top aren't there by dint of being elected to that role, but because they deserve to be. It's an entitlement. Malaysia also prorogued parliament for, I think, an 8-month stretch during the pandemic. So it's just this idea of, okay, those who are here, you can trust us, you can count on us. That it suggests that all the democratic niceties of policymaking and voice and agency are fairly peripheral and never really mattered in the first place, if you can do away with them and still govern even better. So I think that it's probably not a direct one-to-one tie, and it's not that all places that have relational clientelism, for instance, necessarily give rise to this sort of, Schmittian dictator. But it does, in some ways, clear the ground or make it seem less of a stretch than it would otherwise. It's less akin to a military coup, where from a democracy, and more an amplification of prior patterns.
Isn't that the state of exception, though?
Yeah.
That's the state of exception. I'm thinking because so, and I remember that because I was reading. I can't remember. There's a book called The State of Exception.
Okay.
I can't remember who's the author right now, but I started to read it. But essentially, that's what that is. And Donald Trump is actually using that now to go to Baltimore, Chicago, and the rest of them.
Yeah. And so part of what we're finding, I'm going to assume that in this room, no one will be shocked if I say I'm not a big fan of the U.S. president. But so there is a level of pushback and trust in institutions, which suggests the limits. You find less, outside of New York, for instance, less of the sort of door-to-door campaigning and things like that, less of the personal face these days to politicians in the U.S. And I think that's part of why there is this faith of the institutions will save us. Unfortunately, no, they don't. But that's why I think that in some ways proves the rule. Donald Trump is trying to do exactly what so many leaders did in securitizing the pandemic and claiming the state of exception, or of simply trying to amplify these patterns in which you can trust the one at the top has your back. But if citizens are not so well acculturated to assume that that's the way it works, it doesn't mean they're necessarily taking to the streets, as we see, but they may still believe that there's something that would stop that from happening.
Yeah.
Tanir?
In a country where we only have central government for the New Providence, which is our main 70% of the population of the Bahamas resides here, do you think that local government implementation would be effective in thwarting these sorts of things from happening?
So I love this question in part because I've just been learning today that the incredible number of similarities between Bahamian politics and Malaysian. So Malaysia had local government at the time of decolonization and did away with that in the 60s, largely because different parties were winning at the city level than the federal level and the state level. So now local councilors are appointed. There are two levels. It's a larger country, so federal and state. local councils are appointed by the party in power at the state level. And this project fed into a new one that we're trying to wrap up now on local governance, on looking at municipal governance. We focus in on 18 cities across 4 countries. We added Thailand. Thailand was supposed to be part of this project, but there was a coup, no elections. And so a part of our curiosity was precisely this, like it's at the local level, especially in rapidly urbanizing societies, where you have municipal governance, which Southeast Asia, rapidly urbanizing. It's at the local level that citizens encounter the state most tangibly, most potently, most necessarily. Sewage and things like that, bus routes. Some of that's federal in Malaysia, which is just a weird federal system, but still. And so how much does it matter if you have, for instance, a patronage-oriented upper tier, but then a more programmatic lower tier? And so the place that best exemplifies why that is not actually a perfect fix, unfortunately, is the Philippines. So there we have a system of, we have these, what we term in this book, these ad hoc, these long-term, like local machines. So Indonesia, it's these ad hoc networks. Malaysia, very strong parties until recently. Indonesia, the Philippines, you'll have like the mayor on down. So at a city level is a team, and they attach themselves to different parties. In some municipalities, you have this developmentalist or technocratic or otherwise differently oriented leadership that makes things like bottom-up budgeting, which is done by law in the Philippines, makes it meaningful instead of performative. In other places, not at all, because they're family dynasties as well. And so it can be that at the local level, in Indonesia as well, we have particularly several women who are mayors of some large cities like Surabaya. These have been models of good governance and really transforming politics, making it more programmatic. There's still problems. Real estate developers have a lot of sway, for instance. But at the same time, in other cities, if there's a family dynasty, it means they can really control that local government. And so it's not itself a panacea, but in a place like Malaysia that used to have local elections, it still may perform good, we think, to add back local elections, especially in things like reducing the incentive to keep the local bureaucracy weak. So in Malaysia, again, parties appoint these local councillors. You would think they would appoint the best and the brightest. But if you have inept people, or people who just don't have any relevant skills, which is usually the issue, they're just party loyalists. If you have them providing these local services, the MP is going to step in and save the day, or the state legislator. And it also then allows, just because of the way constituency development funds are partisanized, it allows state legislators to use the local development funds that local councillors get, even when they themselves, because of this system, don't have constituency development funds. So it's not a panacea, but it may help to introduce a new level of accountability at the level at which citizens are most likely to need programmatic policies. Yeah.
Okay, I have a comment and then the question. I think, so your presentation was wonderful because you gave language where I think there's epistemic gaps and hermeneutical gaps and we don't have language. That's the first thing. And then the second thing was I saw, like you described the Bahamas in your presentation. That's literally the Bahamas.
Which is fascinating.
Oh, yeah, I know, right? So when you were talking about the micro, I was thinking about yesterday when they was having a drain off in the communities, and a drain off there were politicians going in communities that were flooded, that had drains that were not drained before the storm came, to have a drain off. And then they were going live on Facebook saying, look what we're doing in the community. We here. We really here. We here.
There's a phrase in Malaysia, lubang politician, which means drain politician.
That's a comment.
No, but there's a phrase in Malaysia, lubang politician, which means drain politician. Drainage is such a huge issue in Malaysia that, and so you'll have a couple like progressives say, I'm not just going to go out and fix the drains. You're not going to get reelected. So drains are like,
So my question is, did you think, or did your presentation, you and your collaborators, did y'all think about sexual patronage? Because I'm thinking, we don't talk about, when it's time to talk about that here, everybody having transactional sex here, right? A lot of people are, right? But we don't want to talk about that. And we have a thing in the Bahamas called sweethearting. That's the product of where ministers will have their sweetheart in particular ministries. That watches, they have no credibility, no nothing. They just there because this the minister sweetie.
It hasn't come up in the research, but I will say two phenomena that are at least somewhat related. One would be, and I mention this more just because it's actually it's kind of interesting. So for those who are interested in questions of like gender quotas for parliament and so forth, Indonesia put in a democratized, collapse of an authoritarian regime in the late 90s, Asian financial crisis. The new government that came in, new constitution, included quotas for women's representation. It's called a zipper quota. So one of every 3 candidates has to be a woman. It's always number 3, number 6, number 9. It's rarely number 1. What parties have started increasingly to do is to put a pretty face. And so it's somebody who's not going to draw any votes from the men, but who will draw people to the party because they want to see, like movie stars and people like that, or just rich people who can run their own campaign. But so there's that aspect of like just how these same rules not only may increase particularistic politics, but also just can be twisted. Any rule can be that's what we mean by like the difficulty of institutional reform. Things can go wrong so easily, and you can't predict all the externalities. The other is just dynastic politics is increasing so rapidly across the region. It has always been the dominant form in the Philippines. This is a legacy of American colonialism, is landowning elites. The land is owned by a set of families mostly, and then the Catholic Church. And so that created this whole system based on landowning elites, partly because of anti-communism in the US when they're transitioning toward Philippine independence. The left, which was not the landowning elites, was branded as communists, this Hukbalahap rebellion, suppressed. You can probably imagine the rest of the story because you might have experienced it. But basically, those dynasties were known. But we're finding increasingly, as politics becomes more profitable, it used to be if you were a politician in Malaysia, I go back to the archives and you see these stories of these parties that are getting started in the 40s, late days of colonialism, the women melting down their jewelry to give, the proceeds to the party and people donating money and all of that, or even upstart opposition parties. You pay the party. The Malaysian Islamic Party has a tithe that you every week you give. If you're a member, you give the party money. If you're with the ruling party, you get stuff. It's like literally five ringgit to join for life, which is, just over $1. And then you get a lot. And if you're a politician, you're on these GLC boards, you get rich in politics. So there's an incentive to keep it in the family, right? There are no term limits, so that's not even a factor. It's just the more people you can get in. And so we're finding this across not just the more corrupt parties, it's pretty endemic. And so that's part of it. And we see this, if any of you follow Thai politics at all, you might have noticed the fact that yet another member of Thaksin's family has just been removed from the prime ministership. This was I think it was his daughter, his sister's been, there have been so many members of his family because he was in exile. And so these are all patterns that are another sort of twist on this, but like nepotism in its different forms. And so that may be part of these networks, but you're really trading on that same sense of your family commands the respect of the patron. And so why do people vote for the dynastic family? It's because it may not be a singular individual. Some of this though is just, you have a patronage job to distribute, a worthy paramour who might enjoy that position. That's its own thing. So we didn't see a lot of that, or at least it's not openly discussed. And it didn't come up even in some fairly frank discussions, but so many other twists on nepotism. Yeah.
Okay, so I have 2 questions. I'm sorry, I came in a little bit late to your speech, so you might have covered this, but I was wondering if you timed your presentation with the release of the U.S. State Department saying that the Bahamas is having corruption issues.
I didn't, and I would say, but my government is probably the last government that should be passing judgment on any other governments. So it's I heard about this. I was like, oh, you're kidding me. We're still doing that? Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So, yeah.
And then also, when you looked at the remedies,
yes.
I was wondering, does size matter when we think about the Bahamas and how small some of our constituencies are, especially in the Family Islands, where you had communities that have basically been doing everything for themselves without even though the patronage exists, they've had to do it because there wasn't anybody that was giving them. So
I think that's another. We haven't thought of it so much in terms of size, but rather the sort of the density of civil society. But I think the same would apply. That where you have this self-sufficiency, within a network or whatever else because the state hasn't provided, then it means that it's not necessarily terrible. It means, reinforcing social safety nets is a good thing. If that's done by the state, that's great. If it's not done by the state, you still want it done, right? And so that may be part of it if you have a small community. But the other way that we found, I'm actually thinking of a very specific example here of not so much a small constituency, or a small subgroup. So there's a group called the Ahmadis in Indonesia. They're Shia, which is technically banned in Indonesia, but these are like a trading community that's been in Indonesia for generations. And so we visited one Ahmadi community that they still vote. They're still legal voters. And so they're very narrowly targeted patronage for this community because the state pretends they don't exist. And so it means that this may be a potential block vote because they're in such a socially marginalized position that they have very little to expect from a state, but if a politician comes and will try to court their votes, that may be a rational, may not be very democratic, but it's a rational incentive to support that politician and hope they get into office. So I do think that in a smaller community, you may on the one hand have more possibility of a block vote. So it may actually be a tempting target for that mesoparticularism, for trying to get all the whole community to vote as one for its favorite politician in exchange for some service for that community. It may also be that it's possible to kind of socialize new ways of politics, especially if there is now available state support to supplant or supplement what had been just community provided support. So some of those things may be just easier in both directions in a smaller than larger constituency.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, that I noticed in the research on clientelism, is the tendency to focus on people who you can't count on voting for you.
Yes.
Right? With your funding or whatever.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting to me is how can I put this? The most loyal communities to political parties get neglected.
Yes.
The most, it seems, in our country. Like if you go to those places, those are, you wonder what on earth have these leaders done for you that you keep voting for them. Do you see that tendency?
It's a great question because it's something we really wanted to explore. And so we found that it really varies. Where parties are strong, that happens because you can count on your voters to be attached to your party for something other than just what you're getting at the election time, right? And so that's also why you see less microparticularism often where you have strong parties. The party network, you may not actually get much from them, but they trust when they talk about their base, or in Indonesia, again, like weirdly, it's in English, and basis, our basis, it's like, but when you think that you can trust those people, they're going to get left out. You target swing voters. Oddly, the Malay term is atas pagar, like literally a literal translation of on the fence. So those are the voters that get targeted because it's a strong party state. Not in places where, like in Indonesia, where parties are extremely weak. They're highly personalized. They have essentially each is attached to an oligarch, usually somebody who owns a newspaper or other press enterprise, as well as some other things. And so, the goods that they hand out may be, instant noodles from the brand that person controls. But so where parties are weak, then they're trying to figure out who is our bosses, who is our base, which is usually a social organization. So in Indonesia in particular, the world's two largest Muslim mass organizations are in Indonesia, Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah. Politicians are usually from one or the other. And so they'll say, okay, I'm an NU, Nahdlatul Ulama, I'm targeting that base, but so is everyone else in their party and half the other candidates. So that's where you see this more, provision of microparticularism. But the ones that they target most that's where you get these things of those quotes about, these were from the Philippines because also weak parties, but somewhere here. Sorry, the ones about how, the pesos matter more than blood. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, and so that's where just because he's your uncle doesn't mean you're going to vote for him if somebody, kind of gave you enough of an incentive. Again, microparticularism doesn't usually work in practice, but everyone's worried maybe it will. So you see these elaborate calculations of how much we're spending and how much we expect to get for it, how much the other side is spending. Then you find these crazy strategies like in the Philippines so there's still a communist insurgency, the New People's Army attached to the Communist Party of the Philippines. You get a permit to campaign. that you buy from the CPP, from its army, to be able to campaign in those areas. Otherwise, you cannot campaign in those areas. But we found like candidates in areas near the areas of where the MPA is active, who would like tip off the police when they knew that, because one guy's wife worked in a bank, so when they knew that the other side was going to be distributing cash, they would tip off the police to come and intercept them. Like that sort of, I mean, you get that sort of chicanery, but you kind of have to, that's pretty funny. But anyway.
So is it,
yeah.
it's not intentional, is it? I mean, okay, so you neglect them because you can count on them.
You neglect them when you can count them.
The fact that they remain, the fact those areas remain poor because you don't make any investment.
Exactly.
And so they will always actually be wanting clientelism, unlike if it were an affluent community where you can't sway anybody with $50. But it's not, how much of it is intentional, of it is accidental? You know what I mean? Yes.
Yeah, so this brings us back to the local government question as well. So, microphone. Sorry, I fidget, yeah. So politicians may, in these systems, have an incentive to keep the area underdeveloped and poor. All right, and it's a bit of a caricature, but it's not all wrong. So the clearest example of this in the places we looked at is a place with strong parties where there's, you could target your swing voters to try to bring them in, as opposed to weak parties where there's nothing else to draw them to you but this promise of loyalty. So you're going to target weak parties, you target more money on who you think to be your core voters. There's no point trying to get people to defect because nobody really has a party. But where we found this extremely sharply was in Malaysia. Malaysia, there's a peninsula, and then there's 2 states on the island of Borneo, across part of the South China Sea, Sabah and Sarawak. There were different colonies. They're very different politics, demographically different, a lot different. There's more vote buying there, and also just a different set of parties. But it's also 2 of the least developed states in Malaysia, despite the fact of having oil wealth, timber wealth, natural mineral wealth, state leadership that's extraordinarily corrupt. So very rich families at the top, and just lack of federal investment. Part of that underdevelopment, the ruling coalition for decades and decades would promise electrification, this pan-Borneo highway, irrigation, these other schemes, allowing. So there's affirmative action policies that include the Malays and indigenous groups of Sabah and Sarawak. So the mass of the population. They come in at the lowest level. Those who reach higher in the civil service are ethnic Malays from the peninsula. And so, it's sort of all of these things, jobs, development, infrastructure, tend to be under-delivered in Sabah and Sarawak. Every election you'll find, I've gone there multiple elections where you see the same promises year after year, because maybe this time you'll deliver. And people will tell you there, if they actually delivered on these promises, you wouldn't vote for them because, you're just doing it to get these goods. So the most successful strategy that these opposition parties had was to say, okay, they're promising you electrification. We as an opposition party cannot do a lot, but we can do these micro solar and micro hydro powers. They called them Impian, or Dream of Sabah and Dream of Sarawak. And they got donors, largely from Christian communities on the peninsula and some other groups, just because, again, demographic differences, to donate money to support these micro projects. When the ruling coalition saw these things coming that were, somebody is actually giving electricity, that was the nudge for them finally to, there's a little bit more to it than that, but not a lot. So it's this sort of question of, you want to stay useful. And it's the same at the local level. Like, if you know that you have inept local councilors, then your elected official from your party, who is at the state or federal level, because that's the only places you elect people, can come in and save the day and distribute some money. Or the drains are always an issue. Zinc for roofs, water, what do you call it? The water containers in places that don't have good piped water. So instead of developing potable water supplies, you give everybody these, vats for water branded with the party symbol. And so when the elections are coming, that's what you see.
Great. So I'm going to try to keep it very brief. Just one question.
Yeah.
Well, actually 2, but very brief questions. Just a yes or no for the first one. We have clientelism obviously inside the Bahamas, but one thing I noticed that it's created that I'm seeing now sprout in the United States under DT is the friend-enemy distinction, as Carl Smith talks about, where clientelism then becomes, if you don't align with this particular political party, you will not work in specific areas. Or if you align and you get into a position, when that government loses office, you will be removed from your position.
Exactly.
There's something I call the civil service shuffle. Is that present outside of in your studies? And the second question, sorry, very briefly, is just everything you're talking about, patronage, clientelism, and this, like basically giving small communities different things. Would you agree that the same thing is actually playing out basically within this global liberal world order, where the United States kind of gives things to countries that play nice?
Yeah. And by the way, I put this not because this is macro project, but just for DT himself here. But now we've seen him enough, so let's get rid of him. Okay. Or maybe we still have him. So, at any rate, so the first one, in terms of these sorts of the jobs tied to loyalty, yes, but not everywhere. Okay. So, and I'm really bad at yes/no like answers. I'm sorry, my answers tend to be very long. But so in the Philippines, for instance, we see a lot of that. And so and that has to do with the different nature of the team that you can expect. In Indonesia, you have these ad hoc teams. It's transactional clientelism. The team dissolves after the election. There isn't that same sort of thing. There are old boy networks and so on, but that's kind of for more larger contracts or whatever else. But so because you're going to form a new team next time, we survey people who have been brokers. They don't expect to get a job out of it. In the Philippines, you have these local teams tied to a family that endure throughout the electoral cycle. And so what we found, like mayors were doing, it's chopping up civil service positions at the city level into 3-month segments and distributing those so as many people as possible can have a 3-month patronage job. And so, yes, that happens. You have to be on that team to get that job. So it's, street sweepers and things like that. These aren't great paid jobs, but there's a lot of inequality and a lot of need in the Philippines. And so you do see that. Malaysia, I would say there's a bit less, mostly because it's a bit ambiguous, but in some ways, a legacy of the British civil service is that historically, the civil service has been somewhat more immune, at least the mass of it, from this sort of partisan shift. But the reason I'm hesitating in saying that is because the same party was in power for 62 years. So in many ways, there's a great book by this guy, Hidekune Wishida, that goes into this. There was no need to politicize the civil service because it did the ruling coalition's bidding without being asked, because that's all that had ever happened. Right? And so we're just now seeing whether this is a thing in Malaysia. And indeed, there's a lot of usually apocryphal and just screwy discourse in Malaysia about the deep state, which is following discourse in the US on the deep state. And so I'm waiting to see more of an effect in terms of civil service jobs. So it's a yes and a no. And then whether we should see this in a global system, I was having a conversation with somebody earlier. Yes. I do think that that this idea of patron-client ties among countries, that, I'm waiting, not necessarily inviting, but I wouldn't fault any country for doing this, for sanctions to be put on the US or for, countries not to allow me to enter with my US passport so readily. The only time I saw any pushback, total digression here, I was going to Quebec in February, right at the time of the first of the tariff wars. They still let me in. They're Canadians. They're very nice. But I had to go through a lot of questions, scrutinized by 3 or 4 different immigration officials. And I was just thinking, I won't blame you if you kick me out. I would kick me out. I mean, this is just wrong. But at the same time, we're the big patron. Nobody wants to piss off the U.S. too much for fear. And that's this sort of politics in a macro level. And then you tie that also with the sorts of support that allow welfare systems to develop, for instance, or that allow a more inclusive rather than exclusive reach by encouraging the inclusion and policies of different communities. So yes, I do think that this is part of a global system as well. I mean, that is the global North and South in a nutshell.
Last 2 questions.
Okay.
I'm hungry.
Sorry. Yes. Yeah.
I'm not going to be too long. But
Okay. I won't make that promise. Yeah.
I like the presentation because it's so scientific. Once you understand the theory, that's how it's going to wake up. That's how it's going to feel. Now, there are many factors. I want to go back to Ian Strawn's, Dr. Strawn's question. One of the factors, I think, this is my layman's opinion, one of the factors might be the level of education or intellectualism. Did your research consider that at all as to why people would do the same thing over and over again without changing?
We did, but at the same time, that doesn't, just because we find this in so many places, that really doesn't seem to be the answer. It seems so much more how much people have other options, whether that be because of, again, the density. Do you have just one person to hire you and no other job options, which can be a sign of poverty or can be a sign of the political economy or something else? Do you have other social networks that will help to temper, like, fine, maybe your pastor tells you to vote this way, but some other network you're involved with suggests, well, actually that party or that candidate won't help in these ways. So that density of social interactions, who you're reliant upon, how much agency you can safely exercise, that matters more. And then, whether you have an alternative, like not just do you have other influence, but if a politician comes and offers you money, or in Indonesia, you have these health insurance cards that candidates give out, or ambulance service is usually provided by politicians, not by the state. So yeah, it'll cultivate loyalty, but it's also providing something that the state isn't providing and you need. And so it's much more state capacity and who can access that capacity, and do you have other networks? So those things mattered far more than education per se. And again, the countries that we're looking at span, Singapore, everybody's educated, to Timor-Leste, far less well spread. Indonesia's pretty mixed. We're looking in very urban areas, less urban areas. So it doesn't seem that there's a systematic coordination between or correlation. Yeah, correlation. There goes the science. Yeah. Between education and these outcomes. Although I will say there can be civic education campaigns, not the don't vote because you're a stupid voter if you do that. That doesn't work. But there can be civic education campaigns about what it means to hold a candidate accountable. So I was hearing about initiatives, and actually the last presentation, in the Bahamas about, really voter education. So there's been a big campaign in Malaysia as well. It's a local NGO called Bersih that's done this, where they get crowdsource information about your candidates. What have they done? How, it's what has been their policy stance? There's a lot of party loyalty in parliament, but still, just trying to get people to think about some of those broader issues and evaluate candidates or parties based on, okay, you had this program, your platform on which you ran. What have you done from that? So that can be a matter for civic education specifically, where it can be really helpful. Yeah.
Good day, Mom. My name is Dr. Gary. A question I have for you. You have something called constitutional law and laws.
Mm-hmm.
Constitutional law controls members of parliament.
Yeah.
They actually controls about the rules of constitution.
Yeah.
Who can vote, who cannot vote.
Yeah.
How the electoral process.
Right.
Goes, okay?
Yeah.
My question to you,
mm-hmm.
with the Constitution being the Supreme Law of the land and the laws, based on your
mm-hmm.
research analysis, how effective would you say in comparison
right.
is the Constitution on the whole versus countries that doesn't have a Constitution?
Right.
That probably relies on the statute.
Yeah, so it's hard for me to answer that to an extent because I'm looking at countries like the ones I look at most closely are Malaysia and Singapore, which are former British colonies with a constitution and some similar issues. But I do think neither is a panacea, because even if there are codified electoral rules, like nowhere is vote buying legal, and yet it still happens. Or one of the recent shifts in Malaysia is that they've just passed, after it had been repealed, I think in the 70s, a Parliamentary Services Act, which just brings more of parliamentary control, parliament's budgets, back to parliament, as opposed to under kind of a party's control, essentially. What seem to be small reforms, like having the Speaker of Parliament not be, whether that should be an MP or not, who should appoint the Speaker of Parliament, those sorts of things, that became basically a patronage job within the party, to be the Speaker of Parliament. But that means, whose voices are heard in Parliament may be skewed by similar sorts of patterns. So I do think, on balance, and it may just be my own, upbringing under a constitutional state, I do think it's helpful to have that sort of ultimate normative arbiter of here's a constitution, here's what's codified, here are these procedures. But what we're talking about are often patterns on the ground that may not respond to, or maybe somewhat orthogonal to, what the Constitution is dictating. So even if we say, okay, so we were looking at places that have multi-member districts and single-member districts in terms of electoral rules. They have different procedures for whether the president and vice president are elected together, or whether it be a prime minister who's the head of the government, or, all of these different things. And yet we find these patterns persist across so many different political systems
that it seems that the fact of a particular constitutional regime may affect the relative prevalence or the relative strength of particular types of patronage or particular types of clientelist networks, but not the fact that they are there and operative and matter. Right.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and thank Professor Weiss for a very lively presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Really enjoyed it, and I know that everyone here, including myself, of course, recognize ourselves in what's happening on the other side of the planet.
Yes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, there is food, soda, wine. If you please stay and let's talk a little bit more. Let's pick our brain a bit and let's enjoy each other's company for a little bit before we head on home. Thanks so very much that concludes day one of our Future Democracy Conference.